So the special muscles will actually push some of the skin up, so they'll have little bumps and little ridges, and they no longer look nice and smooth. They look like they're covered in all kinds of interesting things. And this makes them mimic coral and plants and even certain rocks. Hello everyone, welcome to Nature Explorers. My name is Darcy and I'm here from the Danbury Public Library. This week we're going to talk about an interesting creature that lives deep in the sea. It's from a family called cephalopods. This means head-foot. So kind of imagine if your legs were attached directly to your head. A little weird, huh? Yeah, but that's what critters in this family have. So things like octopus and squid, and the one we're going to talk about today, cuttlefish. Aren't these guys kind of cool? So that really long part that's kind of sticking out there, that's their head. It's also called a mantle. And those little arms that are sticking out, well, those are kind of their feet. There are 120 species of cuttlefish, and we are still finding species today. So every now and then they'll find a new one. There's so much in the ocean, and it goes so deep that we don't actually know exactly what is in the ocean completely. There's species we haven't found yet. These guys range in size from the Australian giant cuttlefish, which can grow up to 3 feet long, to the smallest, Barula spirilla, which barely gets over 45 millimeters in length, so it's an itty-bitty guy. Cuttlefish have those 8 arms and those 2 tentacles. So what they do with those tentacles is that's what they use to catch things to eat, because they like to eat all kinds of animals. And what they do is that they'll kind of sit and they'll wait for something to get close to them. And if something tasty starts to swim by, well, they'll kind of put on an interesting display, waddle around, and they'll change their colors a little bit. And they'll even stick some of their arms out and wave them in certain ways, so it looks kind of enticing to what they want to eat. And the thing's like, oh, look at that interesting plant. I want to check that out. But if it gets too close, the cuttlefish sticks out its long tentacles and grabs the thing and pulls it right inside, and then it eats it. And these tentacles can shoot out very fast. So they keep these tentacles in little pockets that are at the base of their arms. And like I said, they can shoot out with extreme speed to grab whatever they want and pull it into their mouth so they can eat it. The cuttlefish, for the most part, are kind of squishy like octopus. They're really kind of moldy and they can squeeze into different shapes. But they have a couple of hard bits. They have a beak, just like octopus do. And this beak almost kind of looks like a parrot's beak. And it's really sharp and hard, and it's hard to see because it's actually buried deep in the middle of all those arms and tentacles that they have. They also have something else that's hard inside their bodies, something that octopus and squid do not have. It's called a cuttlebone. And if you have birds at home like parrots and parakeets, well, you've probably seen cuttlebones because they sell them in pet shops because birds like to gnaw on them. This is a very specific type of bone. It's very porous, which means it has lots of holes in it. And the reason for this is that the cuttlefish uses the cuttlebone to control its buoyancy. So buoyancy is how high or how low you float in the water. So what they do is these cuttlebones have special chambers inside. They have air chambers in the front and water chambers in the back of the cuttlebone. And what they do is if the cuttlefish decides it wants to get closer towards the surface, it fills the air chambers up and removes some of the water from the water chambers. This makes the cuttlefish more buoyant, so it starts to go up. If they want to dive down, well, they'll do the opposite. They'll remove some of the air from the cuttlebone and they'll start flooding the water chambers with water. And this makes them denser and then they start to sink down. Cuttlefish have one of the biggest brains to body ratios of all invertebrates. This means that they have a lot of space in their body to hold their brain. And bigger brains mean a more intelligent animal. So, that big mantle they have is pretty long. In fact, that's most of the body of the cuttlefish. And a good chunk of that houses their brain. It's pretty amazing. In fact, their brain-to-body ratio is so great, it's even larger than most octopi. which is amazing because octopi are very, very smart animals. They can open up jars. They can get into things we don't want them to get into. They're great problem solvers. Now, despite the cuttlefish having a much larger brain-to-body ratio than most octopi, it's not quite as intelligent. It can learn very well, and it can pick up new skills. But the octopus is actually going to outrank it when it comes to intelligence straight up. So what does it use this gigantic, huge brain-to-body ratio for? Well, they use it for what we're going to talk about next, which is camouflage. So these guys are very soft and squishy, and they're pretty tasty. Lots of things like them. Even humans like to eat them. So when you're soft and squishy, and you don't have protective clothing or protective armor, well, how do you defend yourself? They have that beak, but by the time anything gets too close to the beak, well, it might be kind of late. So what they use instead is camouflage. Cuttlefish have up to 200 chromatophores. They're special pigment cells on their skin. But that's not 200 total over their body. No, that's 200 in every millimeter of skin. So that's a lot of cells, huh? Because remember, some of these guys can get up to 3 feet in length. Can you imagine how many thousands upon millions of cells these guys must have on their skin? Because every inch of their skin is covered in these clusters of cells. But they need these cells because what these things do is it aids in their camouflage. So, thanks to these cells, they can change colors. And not just changing colors, they can also make patterns. So if they decide they want to look like a piece of coral and it's kind of bubbly and has different colors in them, well, they can actually mimic that on their skin. They can even strobe. So if you've got a cuttlefish and he's doing a threat display, or maybe he's doing a mating display, and he starts strobing like this guy here, look at that. All those little cells are going and rapidly changing colors. Because this happens very fast. It's not a slow process. It's very quick. On top of that, they have special muscles under their skin. So if they decide they want to look like a piece of coral, they can do the color, but they can also make their skin kind of knobbly. So the special muscles will actually push some of the skin up, so they'll have little bumps and little ridges, and they no longer look nice and smooth. They look like they're covered in all kinds of interesting things. And this makes them mimic coral and plants and even certain rocks. The thing is, it takes a lot of brain energy to control all these millions of cells on the body that do these elaborate colors and patterns. And that's why that huge brain-to-body ratio exists. They're using a lot of that brain space in order to control all these amazing combinations that they do. Cuttlefish have a large, almost skirt-like fin all around that head, that mantle, and it waves around. And that's what they use to move around. And thanks to this wavy fin, they can go in any direction. So a cuttlefish can go forward, it can go backwards, it can go side to side, up and down, and it can even go in a circle. It's pretty mobile. If a cuttlefish wants to move very quickly, it's going to use this big jet that's kind of hooked to the mantle there. And what it's going to do is it's going to send a pulse of water out there and it's going to shoot it backwards very rapidly, almost like a speedboat. Whoosh! And there goes the cuttlefish. And they use this when they want to get away from danger. But there's something else they can use if they want to get away from danger. They have an ink sac. So if they're scared, what they can do is they can shoot out a puff of ink and then swim rapidly away. But they can do something else that's even more interesting. They can make ink decoys. When they do this, the ink takes on the form of a pseudomorph. It's a bubble of ink surrounded by mucus. Sounds really gross, huh? Yeah. But this mucus allows that ink bubbles to stick together, and this can take on the shape and form of a cuttlefish. There's also something extra it can do. This ink has dopamine in it, and that can actually make it so that animals that rely on scent to hunt, well, it kind of paralyzes their scent. So for a short period of time, they really can't smell anything. So what the cuttlefish is going to do is it's going to get that ink bubble ready, that ink bubble that's full of the ink and the mucus. He's going to get it ready to go. And then he's going to shoot that out and then at the same time propel himself backwards rapidly. So now the enemy who is going to come and eat him, he's got this blob of inky brown stuff that kind of looks like a cuttlefish. And he suddenly realizes, I can't smell. Well, this looks like a cuttlefish. This must be a cuttlefish. So while he's trying to deal with that and realizing it's not actually a cuttlefish, it's just ink, the cuttlefish now is a ways away, safely hidden, and hasn't been eaten. So it's pretty amazing. And it's thanks to all these wonderful things like that amazing skin that changes colors and form, and the ink blobs that they can do that sort of resemble cuttlefish, that make these animals the kings of camouflage. Have you been watching squirrels lately? If you have, you probably noticed that they're acting a little strange. They're running around a lot more than they usually are, and they seem to be digging a lot, don't they? Yeah, they're patting around the ground, they're digging things up, they're moving stuff around, and they're eating a lot more. And maybe they're actually getting a little chubby. Yeah. So what's going on with all this? Why are the squirrels acting this way? Well, they're actually doing it because winter's coming. All animals need to control their inner temperature, their core temperature. And we do this too. So if you notice, if you ever get sick and you're not feeling good, your parents might actually go ahead and put their hand on your forehead, or they might stick a thermometer in their mouth. And what they're doing is they're trying to see if your core temperature is higher than it should be, because that means you're fighting with an infection. So all animals have a core temperature, but not all animals regulate this the same way. In fact, there are 3 different ways that this is regulated. First is polykilotherms. These were often called cold-blooded animals. These are things like reptiles and frogs and amphibians and fish. So like our cuttlefish? Yep, they're these guys. What these guys do is that their internal temperature, that core temperature, changes based on their environment. So if they're in a really warm space, their core temperature is going to be higher. If they're in a cool space, it's going to kind of slow down a little bit and go lower. The next category are heterotherms. These are animals that for the most part maintain a constant core temperature, but under certain conditions that can actually change. Bears are heterotherms, and we'll talk about them in another video. For now, we're going to pay attention to homeotherms, and that's where we fall into. Animals that maintain a constant core temperature no matter the environment they're in. So if we're in a really hot area, like during the summer, and we're on the beach, and there's no water around, well, what can happen to us? We can get heat stroke, right? Yeah, that's because that internal core of us has gotten hotter than we can actually handle, and we can't regulate it. And we get really hot, and we start to sweat, and then we start to feel dizzy, and if we don't get water, well, we can be in big trouble. Also, if we're in really cold climates, like up in the Arctic, and we don't have enough stuff to keep us warm, well, we're still trying to maintain that core temperature inside, and if it goes off too much, gets too cold, well, that's not good for us either. So we're animals that have to stay within a very specific range of temperature. Not too hot, not too cold. Most animals are like this, including our little squirrel friends. At least most of our squirrel friends. Squirrels can be divided into ground squirrels and tree squirrels. Most of the squirrels that we see around here, like our little gray ones and the occasional red ones, those are tree squirrels. And they, like us, maintain a constant body temperature. Ground squirrels like to live underground, and they don't always maintain a constant body temperature. They're the ones who can kind of fluctuate. They're more like bears. Occasionally, during certain times of year, their body temperature slows down. But our tree squirrels that we're focusing on for today, they can't slow their body temperature down. And this makes it very hard for them to sleep through the winter. They actually can't do it. So what they do instead is they kind of make nice, cozy little nests. If they have like a little hollow part of a tree, they'll make a nest in there. But also, if you look at some of the trees, you see a ball of leaves and twigs and stuff, and it's kind of big, right? Too big for a bird's nest. Well, that's a squirrel's nest. So they'll make a big ball of leaves and they'll line it with their fur, and a couple of squirrels will get in there and they'll get nice and cozy and they'll sleep a good chunk of the time. But they'll get hungry after a while and they're like, I need to go find something to eat. So then they scurry down to the ground and they go into their pantries. Because like us, squirrels kind of have pantries. They're what are known as scatter hoarders. So this means that the squirrels will find around this time of year anything that seems tasty, and then they'll bury it. And they'll hide them in all kinds of interesting places. So they'll like to bury them in the ground. They might stick them in hollow parts of trees. They might stick them under wood piles, stick them under piles of leaves. They're just putting food everywhere they can think of to put food. Because once winter comes, a lot of the food they normally like the nuts and the berries and certain roots, those are harder to get to. So they need to make these stashes all over the place. And the reason they don't stick them in one specific spot, like we usually think they would, is because they're a little bit paranoid. So say they stick all that food in one tree, and then we come along and we cut the tree down. It doesn't have a store of food anymore. Or stick it all in one spot, and another squirrel comes along and steals it. Squirrels will steal from other squirrels. In fact, because they do steal from each other, you'll sometimes see squirrels doing something a little weird. You'll notice that they're patting the ground, but they didn't actually dig. That's because that squirrel is pretending to bury something. He's hoping that if he pretends, I buried something here, look at me, other squirrels will think, oh, that might be where his stash is. And they won't find his actual stash of food. They're pretty crafty. Squirrels have very good spatial location skills. So a good way to think of spatial location is if you're describing to someone where you live, you could say which street you live on. That could work. But you might also say, my house is blue, and I'm the third one on the street on the right-hand side if you're coming this way. And if you passed a gas station that has a big, bright yellow sign outside, you've gone too far, so you have to go back. Using landscapes and areas that are around you that are visual to describe things is spatial location. And that's what a squirrel does. So it might say, I buried a bunch of nuts under the tree that kind of has a weird little knot that kind of looks bigger than I am. That's where some are buried. And I buried some more by a wood pile. And there's this one part of the wood that kind of sticks out kind of funny. And it kind of looks like Bob, my friend Bob. So that's where some are buried there. And so he kind of remembers where all those little caches are. And there are a lot of caches to remember. Because squirrels will bury hundreds of nuts all over the place in various spots. And they have to remember all of these. On total, squirrels can remember about 90% of what they buried, which is amazingly big. Squirrels are actually intelligent enough, too, to make sure that they only bury things that are going to survive throughout the winter. So if you watch a squirrel during this time of year, he'll pick something up, and he'll kind of put it in his mouth, move around a bit, take it out, roll it around, look at it, stick it in his mouth a bit more, and maybe he'll shake his head. So what's going on when the squirrel's doing all this? Looks kind of weird, huh? What's happening is that squirrel is actually testing that nut to make sure it's going to survive. So it's putting his mouth and it's feeling around with his tongue to see, are there any cracks? Pulls it out and looks again, are there any cracks or any holes? Because if there's cracks and holes in that casing of that nut, well, the nut's going to get water damaged by sitting in the ground all winter, and it's going to start to rot. That's not going to be good. When he goes to get that nut, it's not going to be good to eat. He's also doing that shake test where he sticks it in his mouth and he shakes. So what he's doing there, he's actually listening for a rattle. So he wants to hear if there's actually meat inside that nut, that nice yummy part that they like to eat. And he also wants to hear if it sounds right. Because if insects like gnats and worms and stuff have gotten in there and begun to eat away at the meat of the nut, well, the nut's going to sound different. And if he buries it, even though it seems okay, by the time he goes to get it, he's just going to get an empty shell. That's not good for him either. So instead of wasting time and memory space burying nuts that aren't actually going to survive, they do these tests, like the mouth test and the feeling test and then the shake test, to see if this is actually something that is going to survive. If it's good and it's all intact, they'll bury it away. If it's not, they're going to eat it right then. Nom, nom, nom. And the reason they do this is because even though they can't save it for the winter, they can still pack on all those calories and get nice and chubby, because part of what's going to keep them warm throughout the winter is being nice and chubby. So while we don't see squirrels as much during the winter months, they are running around, and they'll see them occasionally digging around in the snow and looking for all their little stashes of food so they can get through the winter all nice and happy. Is there something about nature that you're curious and would like to know more about? What you can do is you can email your question to me at dsowers@danburylibrary.org, and I'll answer in a future video. In the meantime, I hope you've enjoyed learning about cuttlefish, and I hope you enjoy watching and observing our squirrels and seeing what they're doing, all their interesting behaviors. Until next time, stay safe, stay happy, and stay curious. Bye, everyone!